Hi, everyone. Here is the second half of chapter 12 in regard to groups. So I'm going to pick up where I left off here and talk a little bit about why do people belong in groups. And I stated some of this earlier on Tuesday, the idea that um, we tend to want to belong in groups. That is, group behavior is something that we seem to naturally gravitate toward as humans. Remember that I said earlier that for evolutionary theorists, they believe that being in groups would have helped humans to be able to survive. But even today in contemporary society, being part of a group typically means that you get some positive things out of being in a group. I mean, obviously, as I said, there are some negative things from time to time that mean being part of a group is what we experience. But being part of a group means part of it is a way to define ourselves. So maybe we think of ourselves as Christian or Muslim or Buddhist or Jewish. By defining ourselves in that way, by thinking of ourselves as belonging in that group, it is a way to define, at least in part, who we are. In addition to that, depending upon the type of group it is, we might get emotional support. And again, I use religion as an example of this. Many people um, derive emotional support, not just from the religion itself, but from other members of the religious group to which they belong. In addition to that, and depending upon the type of group it is, we might be able to get things done that we wouldn't be able to by ourselves, or we would be able to do it by ourselves, but maybe not as quickly or as well. And so you can think about how within your family, you might be able to do certain things on your own, but getting them done with other family members means that you get them done more quickly and maybe even better. Also, being in a group, depending upon the type of group, means that we can publicly express our values or our beliefs because we're part of that group. So, for example, I belong to a number of groups, and I'll name one here, the ACLU, which is the American Civil Liberties Union. This is an organization that's been around for almost 100 years now. Actually, I think it has been 100 years. And they're very focused on filing lawsuits when someone's civil rights or civil liberties are challenged, or when there's a constitutional challenge. And this group, of course, is seen as being very liberal, very progressive. And so by belonging to that group, by saying that I belong to that group, that publicly tells people who know anything about the ACLU a little bit about who I am and perhaps the things that I believe in. And so um, for me, that's an important thing. You might belong to some other group, and being part of that group means tells other people something about you. And of course, depending upon the type of group, then you also will get some sort of material or social benefits um, by being part of that group and maybe even taking on the leadership of a particular group. So when we think about, why we're in groups, one of those reasons, as I said, is to divide labor, to get things done more quickly than we could if we were doing things on our own. And so if you think about maybe you live with roommates, the house has to get cleaned. So maybe you and your roommates, you split up all of the various tasks within that apartment or home, and the house or the home gets cleaned much more quickly. Or if you are in a family, again, everyone has a task to do. It gets done more quickly. The house gets cleaned more quickly versus one person doing it all on their own. Now, one of the problems with being in a group, though, is called social loafing. And social loafing is something that we all have either experienced, or maybe we've experienced because we've seen it as members of a group, or maybe even we've been the one engaging in social loafing, meaning that we or someone in a group may decrease our personal efforts because we think other people are picking up the slack. Other people will take care of it. And so maybe we don't have to try as hard. And I sometimes hear this complaint from students who say that the group that I put them in or assign them to, there's maybe one person or two people who aren't really pulling their weight, aren't really doing what they say they're going to do. And so the group then is not achieving the finishing up of the presentation or the paper that they were working on. So social loafing is an unfortunate reality when it comes to being part of a group. Um, yeah, I want us to focus a little bit on individualistic and collectivistic societies. We've talked about these before, and it turns out that depending upon what type of society you're in, you may be more or less likely to join a group. People in individualistic societies like ours we are much more likely to join a group because we have a lot of independence. And in individualistic societies like this, we are often told to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and every person for themselves, etc. However, in collectivistic societies, it turns out that people already are very much attached and bonded to people around them, and so they do not really have to join other groups outside of the groups that they already belong to, which is typically family and friends and extended family members, because they've already got that built-in network of people to help them. Whereas in an individualistic society such as this, we might need a mentor and we don't have a ready one, because we're so individualistic. So maybe we join a group where we can find a mentor. In a collectivistic society, you already have a built-in mentor because there are people there who are already very closely connected to you, and you can rely on that person to be your mentor. Um, Being part of a group means that there are some benefits, and I asked some of you to talk about this on Tuesday, and some of you mentioned some of the value of having difference within a group, the diversity and being in a group. And I think I specifically remember Ronnie talking about how um, understanding the material was one thing, but then being part of a study group and hearing from other people how they thought about the concepts or what they took away from the question or what how they interpreted the question was something very useful for them, for her. And so it does turn out that being part of a group can be quite valuable, especially if we feel as though we need more information and we can get that information from a diverse group of people. Um, on the other hand, there may be a downside to a study group if people are assigned different parts of information to tackle and to understand and then present it to the group, for example, and they don't do that. And so if you're studying for a midterm and each one of you is assigned a question in the study group, and your job is to go off and um, research the question, study the question, and come back so you can explain it to the other members of the group. If you don't do that, then that means when the study group comes together, people aren't prepared for that particular question, and now they've all got to go off and do it on their own, which means that if it's too close to the midterm, maybe some of those members don't do well on that question if they get assigned it. There are some advantages as well as disadvantages to having cultural diversity in the group, not just diversity in terms of um, racial and ethnic diversity, but also gender diversity, as well as diversity in terms of social class and religion, etc. Um, it does seem that when a diverse group of people is trying to tackle a problem or generate a solution to an issue, that they do tend to generate a wider range of solutions, which means that the more solutions, possible solutions you have, perhaps the better solution will eventually rise to the top. On the other hand, some of the disadvantages are that the racial and ethnically diverse groups might not communicate as well, and there might be some lack of cohesion there. So there are definitely some advantages as well as some disadvantages, but overall, more workplaces are focusing on the idea of diversity being more of an advantage because you can work with a disadvantage by encouraging people to communicate in ways that are more productive and having conversations about how to stay motivated and how to communicate in ways with one another in ways that are acceptable and understandable to everyone in the group. Um, Also want to just talk really quickly here about group polarization, because that can happen in a group, which is simply this idea that within a group, um, if let's say there are 5 or 6 friends on a Friday night, and you are all trying to decide what to do on a Friday night, and one of a couple people throw out ideas, and 4 people out of 6 say, "Oh yeah, I want to go see that movie," and the other 2 people say, I don't really want to go see that movie. Let's do something else, and they come up with other ideas. Over the time that the group discusses whether these other ideas are better or not, what will typically happen is that those 4 people who were in that camp of let's go see this movie are the ones that are much more likely to persuade the other 2 eventually to go and see the movie. Even though maybe that wasn't their first choice, they'll likely at some point decide, okay, all right, it's not that big a deal. I'll go see that movie, even though it's not one that I really want to see. Um, and um, while the example I gave is one that is very it's not a huge deal. It's not really important whether you go see a movie or you go bowling, for example. In other situations, it can be very bad. And this leads me to a discussion of something that sociologists and social psychologists talk about, known as groupthink. Um, and groupthink is the idea that members of a group will tend to reach a consensus even if they have to agree, or even if they have to uh, ignore the facts or the truth. They're much more likely to reach a consensus because the people who are more persuasive will pressure those people who are least um, staunch in their beliefs or their feelings about a particular situation. The more persuasive people will badger or persuade or coerce or in some way will keep pressuring the other people such that those other people will then say, all right, maybe even throw up their hands. All right, you know what, you win. I'll go with what you're saying. Again, this is really, really crucial idea because it happens throughout this country and in other countries too. And the place where I can think of it happening in a really detrimental way is when you have a jury. When a jury engages in groupthink, and it happens quite often, that means that some people may be convicted or, in the converse, may be acquitted simply because of the pressure of more persuasive or more outspoken members of the jury and their ability to then pressure or coerce or persuade those other less staunch believers in their positions on the jury. And so, again, people often will just go along with the group because it's easier to do that. In fact, there's I don't know what to call it, it's a saying in the US, go along to get along, right? So agree with the group so you can get along with everybody. And the same thing is true of juries, unfortunately. Also, here's an interesting idea because it, I think, really is prescient at this time when so much of not just online learning, but so classes going online, but also people working from home, that computer mediated decision making um, typically leads to lower quality decisions. Meaning that even if we're doing virtual meetings or virtual classes, etc., um, the quality of those interactions seems to be of a lower quality than when we are actually speaking face to face in a room together. And I mentioned on Tuesday my own feelings about how things have changed for me as an instructor who started out teaching a class face to face, and now it's become something different, and it's not necessarily what I prefer because if I'm going to teach an online class, then I just teach solely online classes. And so to have it change in the middle of the semester for me has been a little difficult just because this is not the kind of class that I signed up to teach. I had a different mindset going into the class versus what we're doing now. Um, Really quickly here, this is a figure that's showing group characteristics in terms of how cohesive the group is, whether there is isolation from outside influences, etc., then that can lead to groupthink, what I just talked about, which then can lead to the psychological state of group members being um, affected by um, the um, the groupthink. And then you have the discussion processes where things are not going so well. And then you, in the end, you have that increased likelihood of poor decisions or poor decision making. Um, Now, I want you to think about leaders and whether or not you've been a leader in a group, whether, if you're a supervisor at work, you're a leader, or you are on a team sport, or you're in a club, maybe you've been a leader. And why you became a leader has something to do, for most people at least, with not just social status and perhaps material gain, although I'm not sure many of us are being leaders for that reason. But what do we think we can contribute as a leader? We're much more likely to become a leader if we think we can contribute something positive. People who volunteer to be leaders or step up to be leaders typically are people who are more ambitious, people who have a lot of energy, people who are well liked, and often male. And if we look at politics as an example of this, we know that women are more than 51% of the population in the United States, and yet women make up such a small percentage of senators. There are only 100 senators, and the last time I checked, there were about 25 female senators, and there are 535 members of the House of Representatives. And the last time I checked, I think it was only about 18, 19% of them are women. And so clearly, women don't run as often as men do for political office. And what might be some of the reasons behind why women don't run as often? I don't think it's that women are less ambitious or less energetic. I think a lot of it has to do with the kind of messages that women get about whether or not they should run. Um, all right, so let me see. All right, so just want to really quickly here go over an idea as to why that gender inequity in leadership positions may exist. And a key idea here is social role theory. This idea that men and women, we are taught how we're supposed to behave depending upon particular gender roles that our families teach us. And even though a lot of gender roles have changed over the last 35, 40, 50 years, it is still the case that some people will continue to view women as less capable, less intelligent, even less able to deal with um, uh, emergencies, things such as that. And women often as leaders they want to engage in what's known as that transformational style, and that's back here really quickly. This transformational style of leadership is where the the leader wants members of the group to reach its goals better. And women often are leaders who say to the group, hey, look, we can do this better than we ever have, versus men who may come in and say, well, here's what I know how to do, and here's how we're going to do it. Women may be more likely to try to include people into the decision making process. Now, whether people prefer the transformational style versus the more trickle down, male in charge style, really depends, I think, in part on how we are socialized, whether we adhere to the more um, typical gender roles or whether we have been socialized with less typical gender roles and an acceptance of difference in gender roles. Um, so that's the end of this chapter. It was a pretty brief chapter compared to some of the others, but it's an important one because I think we all need to think about why we belong to the groups that we belong to and what are the positive things about that group and what are some of the negative things about each of these groups, because there is no group that is perfect. But these groups are all important to us. Even those of us who think of ourselves as loners typically belong to at least a few groups.